Hi, everyone. We're going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes as stragglers trickle in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. We will go ahead, and it's just we always have people funneling in at the last second. So I don't want that to distract, and I don't want them to miss it, but we'll go ahead and just get started with some introductions so we can get to the real thing that you're all here for tonight. My name is Sophia Zanowski. I'm the coordinator of development, registrar, and assistant to the dean at St. Bernard's. I also moonlight in IT, so I just kind of want to give a brief run through of the format of this event since it is a bit different than some of our other events. If you've been to 1 or 2 of our other theology and cultures this semester, you know the drill, so hang tight. But you might have noticed that when you came in, everyone is muted and you're unable to mute yourself. Also, if you put anything in the chat box, it will only go to me. So it is a bit different than some of our more casual events, but we decided to go with this different format to allow our presenters to thoroughly prepare, just given how broad and important this topic is, and so that we can keep it to an hour tonight, because in the interest of time, we could go on and on with this kind of thing. So instead of a live Q&A at the end of the event, there was a survey located in your registration confirmation email where you could submit anonymous questions. And so our presenter, just like our last 2 presenters in this series, has used that feedback to craft his talk for tonight. Like I said, I do some IT stuff, so if you have any tech issues throughout the night, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll also be recording this talk, so I'll send that out probably tomorrow or the next day so that if you miss anything or anything goes wrong with your Wi-Fi, no fears, you'll be able to watch it again. Also, at the end of this event, we'll be doing the novena for Faithful Citizenship, which is out of the USCCB. So if you'd like to stay and pray with us, please do so. I'll put the link to the novena for the first night of the novena in the chat, so you can also continue with the rest of the days as well if you'd like. Now, I'm also here to fill in the shoes of Mr. Matt Brown, our Director of Admissions and Financial Aid. He usually gives exciting academic and institutional updates, but he just welcomed a brand new, beautiful baby girl, Ella, so he can't be here, and I'll try to do my best to fill in for him. We are in the thick of the fall semester, but already preparing for the spring semester. Our admissions deadline to start a program in the spring is December 11th. Just this past fall, we launched a couple really exciting certificate programs, which are great because they're less than a master's degree. So you might be, towing the water, seeing if a master's degree is for you, or never ever considering a full master's degree, but you want to take some courses with us. So we have a couple of those, and we also have some really cool electives in the spring, like Catechesis in the New Evangelization, 20th Century Catholic Literary Imagination, a class called Hellscapes, which is Geographies and Punishment, Prayer, Penance, and Purgatory. So we're really exploring some cool things this semester, and if any of that interests you, definitely take a look at maybe auditing a course or taking one, or even going for the full master's degree or a certificate program. So with that, Thank you for listening. I'll be sure to send out a confirmation email. So if you have any questions about anything I just said, feel free to email me. But I'm going to hand it over to our president now, Dr. Laughlin, to introduce our speaker and talk a little bit about our series on faithful citizenship.
Thank you, Sophia. It's really great to see a lot of you people here. Haven't seen a lot of you in quite a long time. And welcome. Good evening. Welcome to the third in our three-part series on faithful citizenship, offered through our monthly Theology and Culture event. As Sophia said, my name is Dr. Stephen Laughlin, and I'm the president of St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry. Before we begin, I'd like to discuss briefly the purpose of this three-part Theology and Culture series and what we hope this does for you, especially in light of the divisive political culture we are currently living in. Our faith includes the promotion of the common good, the upholding of the inherent dignity of the human person, and an active participation in public life. So what does this look like today in 2020, in the midst of so many trials and travails, and on the eve of a highly divisive presidential election? We can at least reaffirm with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops that our dedication to the kingdom of God means that we live not just any citizenship, but faithful citizenship, one that is rooted in our identity as followers of Christ and as brothers and sisters to all who are made in God's image. For all Catholics, including those seeking public office, our participation in political parties or other groups to which we may belong should be influenced by our faith and not the other way around. At St. Bernard's, we're dedicated to the honest discussion about the demands of an authentically lived faith and the impact of that faith in every area of our lives. So we've crafted this three-part series of Theology and Culture to meditate upon the issues introduced here, particularly the nature and demands of authentic political engagement, lining up three tremendous speakers to share their reflections upon this very important topic. And so it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the last of our three speakers, Dr. Rodney Howsare. Dr. Howsare joined the faculty of DeSales University in Pennsylvania way back in 1999 and was promoted to the rank of tenured professor in 2010. He holds a doctoral degree from Marquette University with a specialization in fundamental theology. His book publications include Hans Urs von Balthasar and Protestantism, the ecumenical implications of his theological style, published by T.N.T. Clark. How Balthasar Changed My Mind, co-edited with our second speaker, that is the second in this series, Dr. Larry Chapp, for Herder and Herder, and Hans Urs von Balthasar, A Guide for the Perplexed, again with T.N.T. Clark. He has had scholarly articles published in Communio, Nova et Vetera, Fides Quaerens Intellectum, and the Josephinum Journal of Theology. He has delivered several presentations to the College Theology Society. I could sit here all night and easily say so much about Dr. Howsare, having worked with him at DeSales for almost 20 years. We were actually hired at the very same year. However, the joy of Dr. Howsare is not in any description of him, but simply in the experiencing of the man himself. And so, without any further delay, let us warmly welcome virtually Dr. Rodney Howsare.
There, I unmuted my audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Very good. First of all, I just want to thank, I'm very honored. I want to thank the people at St. Bernard's for asking me to do this with such esteemed company that went before me, and big shoes to fill. So I just want to first give a word of thanks and just say how honored I am and humbled I am to be able to be a part of this. I think it's an excellent idea, to do. It is enormously confusing times, I think, for all of us right now, and the political environment, combined with COVID and the lockdown and all these different wearing masks and all this stuff, I think is really taking a toll on people. And so it's important, I think, at these times to sit back and try to get maybe some critical distance from the whole thing. And I think we Catholics are in a unique position to do that, to step back and look at where we are right now in the light of our illustrious 2,000-year history, but also under the species of eternity, as we say. So we have been given a participation in a God's eye view of things, in God's revelation through Jesus Christ. So I want to say some things tonight that I hope will be comforting to you, or at least will hope you to be able to step back a little bit and to take a deep breath and realize that the entire world is not at stake in the upcoming election tomorrow. I read an article not that long ago that began with this really kind of funny way, saying one of the most important things in the history of the world is going to happen in the beginning of November, and it's going to be, instrumental and life-changing, and it's hard to know how it's going to turn out. And I mean, ... the Feast of Christ the King on November, 3rd or 4th or whatever it is, And I thought that's a good way to begin an article, right? Because that Feast of Christ the King certainly takes precedence over the election of the President of the United States of America. But anyhow, let me just begin by just explaining a little bit what I'm going to do. My paper has basically 2 parts, and then kind of a little conclusion. And I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as I can. And I've written down some of the questions that you all have posted on the website that I was given, some questions that you would like me to address maybe at the end. So if time permits, I'd be glad to do that. So the 2 parts of the paper go accordingly. What I want to begin with is to kind of reintroduce us to the classical Christian political tradition, which I think has largely been lost even by Catholics in an American context. And I think that's happened because we have sidled up to one or the other of the 2 political parties, both of which in different ways represent the modern political project. So Republicans represent it in one way and Democrats represent it in another, but they both stem from what I will call a post-Lockean world. But we Catholics have a tradition that goes much, much deeper than that. And that tradition begins really with Aristotle in some important way, because he was co-opted by us into our tradition, even though he's a pagan. It begins with Plato, of course, also, but then is taken up by the early Christians, and they add things of their own distinct flavor into that political tradition. And I don't know that many Catholics fully appreciate that there is a Catholic political tradition, and Catholic social thought, of course, builds on that tradition. I think it's important that we steep ourselves in that tradition, even though it doesn't fit into our political categories at all. In some things, Thomas sounds like a liberal, and some things, Thomas sounds like a conservative, and those aren't his categories. You can't pin him down. So that's something I think already that's going to be hopefully somewhat liberating for us. Second thing I'm going to do in the paper then is I'm going to look at that modern turn. What happened in early modernity that created this thing we call liberal democracy? And what I would like us to do as Catholics, and what I would like to try to aid you all in doing, is, as I said before, get some critical distance from the liberal democratic tradition. Not that we reject it entirely. We live in a liberal democracy, for better or for worse. We're citizens in that democracy, and we owe that democracy the allegiance due to the civil authorities. But we are not beholden to that tradition like we are beholden to God and to the teachings of the church. And so I would like to encourage you all that even when you enter into your political life, you do that first as Catholics and not first as Democrats or first as Republicans. So that's going to be kind of the gist of my talk, but I'm afraid it's going to get a little technical. And I'm afraid also that I'm going to give you no help whatsoever in voting tomorrow, 0. In fact, I'll probably make it worse. If you were confused coming in, you're going to be even worse when you go out. So anyhow, without further ado, here's my paper. I apologize if it's dreadfully boring, but maybe you can, I saw somebody smoking a pipe, maybe, get a drink or something, whatever. So here it goes. I have been following American politics for almost 40 years, And I don't think I'm being alarmist when I say that things right now are as odd as they have been in my lifetime. It's not just that our two parties have strong disagreements about what needs to be done to make our lives together better. It's that the two sides see each other no longer in terms of truth and falsity, but in terms of pure good and pure evil. Moreover, it seems like rationality is no longer even being faked by either side. It's almost as if each side is simply admitting that they want nothing more than power over the other side. And both sides seem willing to do whatever it takes to win at any cost. Furthermore, the American media aren't even trying to feign objectivity anymore. And some have admitted that it's no longer even an ideal. The new state of American politics has left a lot of people scratching their heads and has more than a few of us trying hard to see how we fit into either of the parties of our two-party system. I think this might be especially true of what we might call millennial Catholics, who tend to be more conservative than their baby boomer forerunners with regard to Catholic doctrine, but more progressive than them when it comes to economics, race relations, immigration questions, and the like. But to still others, this situation has given rise to an unprecedented willingness to raise fundamental questions about the entire project of liberal democracy. Perhaps the gradual destruction of the environment, the concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, the breakdown of the traditional natural family, the sexual confusion of our teenagers, the rise of teenage suicide and depression, the total and all-encompassing nature of social media in our lives, our addiction to our cell phones, our inability to have difficult, complex, intelligent discussions about important matters and the like, are all signs pointing to a deep problem with this thing that we call modernity. The silver lining, perhaps, in all of this is that it frees us to look at pre- and possibly post-liberal solutions. Perhaps, for instance, capitalism isn't the only economic option. Perhaps turning nature over to science and technology will not necessarily solve all of our problems. Perhaps giving people greater and greater sexual freedom will not result in greater human happiness and well-being. More and more people, that is, are beginning to see major problems in the underlying logic of both of our political parties and are therefore open to look elsewhere for more viable solutions. What I would like to argue in this paper is that this situation, wherein more and more people are becoming frustrated by the pathetic options in the American political arena, is the perfect situation for the Roman Catholic to be in. For we, unlike the rest of America, have the resources truly to think outside of the liberal box. After all, we preceded liberalism by over 1,600 years. And if we bring Catholic social thought into the equation, we have at our fingertips something like a foundation of a truly post-liberal approach to politics that provides us with something like a critical distance from both of our parties. But in order to unpack this, I'd like to give a brief overview of the history of the problem, an overview intent on widening our horizons. If liberalism is the result of a wrong turn taken in the history of political thought, and I think it is, then the only way to find our way out is to go back to the great tradition. In the High Middle Ages, we were presented with a synthesis of classical Greek political thought and distinctively Christian political thought. Although that synthesis was not perfect and was never perfectly applied, there is a lot about it that we can still learn from. Indeed, most of the major components of Catholic social thought are to be found there. But since we are talking about a synthesis, it might help to look at the origin of that synthesis. Aristotle's politics rests on his understanding of the human being in the place of the human being in the larger cosmos. For Aristotle, the universe is the unraveling, so to speak, of an underlying rational order or principle. In the superlunary realm, or the realm above the moon, we find that order almost perfectly laid out in the totally rational movement of the planets. Once we get below the moon, however, we see this order played out in less rational ways, beginning with inorganic matter, working up through living plants, up through living and sentient animals, and culminating in the living, sentient, and rational animal that we call man. This is a hierarchical order of increasing intelligence and freedom. Each thing that exists exists as a this or a that, insofar as it reveals in its various parts an underlying essence or substance. What Plato would call the forms, the ideas for things, always existed for Aristotle in things and not separately from them. This underlying essence is what we know when we know a thing, and it's what our names for things refer to. The human being, and this is the takeaway, is also a being of a certain sort. The human being is defined by Aristotle as a rational animal, a thinking, sentient, living being. And just as all other living things are ordered to ends which are built into them, for instance, an acorn is ordered from within to be an oak tree, a deer is ordered from within to eat plants, drink water, and occasionally make baby deers. That is, a deer is ordered from within to thrive as the sort of being it is. So too the human being has a natural end built into it, and that natural end is happiness. But because the human being is rational, the human being's happiness is of a special sort. A human being cannot be happy, for instance, in only satisfying his or her animal needs. We are naturally ordered to truth and goodness, those higher goods, and can't be happy without them, according to Aristotle. Now, because human beings are rational, there is this striking paradox that they are not as equipped by nature to thrive as the sorts of other things in nature are, right? We're not automatically out of the chute going to thrive as human beings as easily as a deer out of the chute is going to thrive as a deer. It's not as automatic to us as the thing. Human beings have to intentionally become the sorts of beings that we are. Furthermore, we need help. We come into the world as babies and need human beings at a higher level of maturity to aid us in our development into the sorts of beings that we are. Families, therefore, help to bring us into our humanity. We have to be educated into our humanity, for Aristotle. But families alone don't suffice either, because no single family can have everything that it needs to thrive among other families. So families tend naturally to form into clans, and clans form into cities, etc. It is out of this natural human sociability, which is rooted in the fact that we are rational and have to live lives together deliberately rather than just instinctively, that politics arises. Politics for Aristotle is life lived together under the order of reason and goodness. No matter what form government takes, and Aristotle doesn't insist on any particular form of government, in this he's more liberal than liberals, who always think that democracy has to be the one, its job is to look out for the common good and to aid its citizens into being the sorts of beings that they are, that is, beings ordered to truth and goodness or virtue. As Aristotle puts it in his Ethics, and this is a quote, "The end of politics is the best of ends, and the main concern of politics is to engender a certain character in the citizens and to make them good and disposed to perform noble actions." Now, at this point in our quick overview, we might pause to voice a typical modern objection. Isn't this too much to expect of politics? If that's your knee-jerk reaction, it's because you've been indoctrinated with liberalism. Wouldn't such interference in the lives of its citizens entail an overreach on the part of the city or the state? But it would be good to remember something crucial at this point. For Aristotle, human beings naturally want to be virtuous. The city's so-called interference in the lives of its citizens would have constituted no greater overreach than the interference of parents in the lives of their children. Although we don't want to push that analogy too far, it is an analogy for Aristotle. Just as parents look out for the good of their kids and not just the happiness in material things of their kids, states have an analogous responsibility. Okay, so there in a nutshell is Aristotle. A few hundred years after the time of Aristotle, the world met another figure who was to change the the face of future political thought, and that person was Jesus Christ. It might seem strange insofar as Jesus is not what we typically think of as a political figure. He was rather a religious figure, but we should be careful of reading our separations back into ancient history. For people at this time period, they did not divide the political and the religious. Indeed, the two went together, with the political absorbing and controlling the religious. In the Roman Empire, the emperor was also priest of religion, the top priest. into this monistic situation. When I say monistic, I mean a situation where there's really one power, and that's the political power, which has consumed the religious dimension. Into this situation, Jesus introduced a rupture of sorts. When asked whether or not we should pay taxes to Caesar, Jesus said famously that we should render the things of Caesar to Caesar, but render the things of God to God. We should not read into this statement an early endorsement of what we modern people call the separation of church and state. Jesus' statement is more subversive and paradoxical than that. Let's, for the sake of time, distill 3 principles from Jesus' statement that will animate Christian political thought going forward. First, this is the first principle. Government is legitimate, and we owe the allegiance to it that it is due. This is going to be a consistent theme in the New Testament. If I can borrow just from one verse to kind of prove this, 1 Peter 2:13-17, but I could get verses from Paul. I could get verses from all over the New Testament that say the same thing. This is the verse from 1 Peter, quote, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. Live as free men, yet without using your freedom as a pretext for evil, but live as servants of God," unquote. Notice that Peter is recognizing the legitimacy of government authority. And check this out. This is at a time of Nero. If you think Trump's bad, right? So our first principle concerns the legitimacy in principle of those who govern us, even when they happen to be shady characters. But to this, we must add a second principle, which makes things more complicated. Namely, we owe God more than we owe Caesar. We owe God specifically our highest obedience. And that means that when push comes to shove, we must obey God even over Caesar. These 2 principles together give witness to the dual citizenship that belongs to the followers of Christ. It's what makes our life in this world complex. It's why we Christians struggle to figure out how to live in a world, right, where we're citizens of 2 kingdoms at the same time. But let's return for a moment to the text from 1 Peter, because in a subtle way, it gives rise to a third principle. First of all, it is in agreement with Aristotle that government concerns what is good and what is evil. It is there, again, to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do good. That's what 1 Peter says. That sounds a lot like Aristotle, that government does care about good and evil. Additionally, however, since God is the ultimate source of what is good and what is evil, temporal government is under God in Christian view. That we're not going to get in Aristotle. Aristotle flattens things, right? There's a rational order, but there's no separate dimension that we have to negotiate. There's no heaven for Aristotle. There's no personal God, etc. Right? So Christianity introduces this other element that gets things a little wacky. Additionally, however, since God is the ultimate source of what is good and what is evil, temporal government is under God. That's where I'm picking up. Indeed, Jesus later tells Pilate that he would have no power over Jesus if the Father hadn't given it to him. You remember that scene with Jesus and Pilate? Jesus says, "Pilate, I know you have power over me right now, but you wouldn't if it weren't for my Father." This notion of government as judgment, to borrow from Oliver O'Donovan, is a crucial element of the distinctively Christian contribution to the Western political tradition. As the centuries unfold, these 3 principles are going to animate the ways in which Christians behave in the face of temporal leaders. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to get to this quote from Pope Gelasius, but let me just summarize what I was going to say there, just to expedite things. At different times in church history, these 3 principles that I just delineated different ones are going to rise to the top. If I'm in the era of the Christian martyrs, for instance, I'm going to be saying no to the emperor a lot more than I'm saying yes, right? Because he's going to ask me to worship him. And I'm going to say, "I can't worship you." And he's saying, "Well, I'm going to have to kill you." And you say, "Well, you have to do what you have to do," right? So that no gets really pronounced in that early era. But, and this is key, even in the earliest ages of the Christian faith, Christians were exhorting each other to give the due to the political authority that they were due. And they would even write letters to the emperors trying to convince them that they were actually good citizens. Even though they wouldn't bow down to the emperor, they would obey him in temporal matters. So even in that early era, there is that yes and that no is there. Now that third principle, that the temporal leader comes under the spiritual leader, is still a little bit difficult for them to grasp. They have no imagination for that. It's too out of the realm of possibility. The next era in church history that's kind of interesting here is the era of Constantine and Constantinian Christianity. Now we have political leaders who are also, at least ostensibly, religious believers. Now the yes to the emperor is going to be a little bit stronger than the no. So one of these, the respect for government authority goes to the front, and the saying "you're not God" can go down a little bit. But check this out. Even during this period, there was also a no. And the reason for that is because the emperors would routinely try to interfere in church business in order to bring peace to the empire. Theologians would get into squabbles about how many natures Jesus had and about whether he was homoousios with the Father and all these different things. And the emperors would be like, okay, knock off all the squabbling. I have an empire to run, and you guys are causing division. And during this time period, therefore, the great bishops and the great theologians would have to stand up to the emperor and say, hey, we're going to have these fights, and if you don't like it, you can kill us. And some of them got killed. Chrysostom, for instance, right? For refusing to kind of not try to get to the bottom of theological matters. So even in this period where we have allegedly Christian emperors, they still tend to be pragmatists, right? And so the Christian still has to be prepared to say no when they violate Christian business. Now, during the era that is to come, what we tend to get is this third principle rising to the top, and that's the possibility of a Christian emperor who cooperates with spiritual power in order to make the empire more Christian, but also to help the church keep the faith orthodox. And all of the great Christian theologians during the fourth, fifth, and sixth century are going to support that arrangement in various ways. This is Hugo Rahner summarizing Augustine on the very thing. Okay, so check this out. Beyond political success or misadventure, it is the duty of a good emperor to encourage respect for God's law in this life. And on this, in the final analysis, is based the idea, much discussed in Augustine, that the Christian authority of this world has something to say in the area of religion, but only at the point where heretics seek to disturb the God-ordained peace of the church and thus disturb the state too. Church and state indeed ought to realize a high ideal in common, to build the city of God on earth. That principle, that secular or temporal power and spiritual power can work together to make this world look more like the kingdom of God, is a central principle of classic Christian thought. And it's something that we can't even imagine in a liberal world. We don't even try to imagine it in a liberal world too much. Something to think about. I could read a quote from Pope Gelasius saying the same thing, but I'm not going to. He's this great pope who, when one of the emperors was started to court and a certain heresy, he wrote the emperor a letter and told him, hey, I hear that you think that this Peter Mongus guy is great, but he's a heretic, and you are not above the church, you're in the church, and if you don't knock it off, I'm going to excommunicate you. So that would kind of happen sometimes with these popes. He'd be like, hey, I'm just going to tell you, their principle was the emperor is in the church, not above the church, which is pretty, brave move considering these emperors had a lot of power. Okay. Now, what I want to do now is jump to the next part of the paper where I talk about these two elements being synthesized in the work of Thomas Aquinas. And this is important because Thomas Aquinas forms the backbone of Catholic social doctrine. We think that Catholic social doctrine begins with, the social encyclicals, but those social encyclicals are just building on Thomistic principles. So here's Thomas Aquinas, just in a nutshell, as quickly as I can. For Thomas, as for Aristotle before him, human beings are naturally political animals. Although we are rational, we are born into the world the most helpless and incapable of fending for ourselves. Also, like Aristotle, Thomas believes that human beings have a natural orientation to truth and goodness. Furthermore, Although each human being can to some degree look out for his own good, no individual possesses all he needs for human flourishing. For this he needs others, first family, but beyond that, the others of a society. This natural political order is responsible in its turn for the common good. That's goods that we all share in common, not just the accumulation of individual goods. Common good would be peace, for instance, which we all benefit from. As Ernest Fortin puts it, and this is a quote, since the individual is often animated by passions and desires that do not coincide with those of the other parts, it is essential that in a city there be a single authority whose proper task is to look after the good of the whole and to maintain order and unity among its parts. Furthermore, just as the good of the body takes priority to any of its individual parts, you might have your leg cut off if the cancer threatens to spread to your body, right? So the body takes precedence to the part. So for Thomas, the common good takes precedence to individual good, right? I have to remind my conservative Catholic friends of this, who refuse to wear masks and stuff. Furthermore, Thomas retains Aristotle's fuller than modern understanding of the role of the state in the promotion of virtue. I'm going to skip the quote for time's sake, but basically Aquinas agrees that the state does have a role in promoting the virtue of its citizens. It's not just life together, it's life lived well together that we're looking for. In order to specify all of this, Thomas addresses the issue of law. He speaks first of the eternal law, that is the law as it exists in the mind of God. For Thomas, this is law in the true sense, and everything else called law is merely an approximation of it. As Thomas puts it, the plan by which God, as ruler of the universe, governs all things is a law in a true sense. Now, this law, which God governs the universe and all things in the universe, obey in their own way. This is Aquinas talking. Everything God plans obeys the standards of his eternal law and bears the imprint of that law in the form of a natural tendency to pursue whatever behavior and goals are appropriate to it. That's what's key. God's eternal law is placed in the natural order, and in the natural order, things have tendencies toward ends. That's because of God. So God is in things. As Thomas later says, God is in things and innermostly. He's in all things and innermostly. In the human being, this gets a little tricky because we have free will, but we also have rationality. And so we cooperate with God by introducing the eternal law into our lives. It's imprinted in us in our natural tendency for the good, which Thomas calls the natural law. So the natural law is our human understanding, imperfect as it is, of the eternal law. And Thomas is actually a little more confident than Aristotle. I think it's because of his doctrine of creation and the fact that all human beings are created in God's image. We all have a natural desire for God. We have a natural desire for the good. And we all have a basic understanding of what that is. Aristotle sort of reserved this more for intelligent, aristocratic philosophers. They were the only ones that kind of figure it out. The rest of the people need help. But Aquinas is more confident that even the average person has this, even though he doesn't necessarily think the average person will be virtuous. However, Thomas admits that this natural tendency in human beings is not sufficient as it is in animals. Rather, because we are rational, it needs training. And because we are not fully virtuous, sometimes we need coercing. And this is why, in addition to the eternal law and the natural law, we have need for human laws. And for Aquinas, human laws are very important. Human law is derived from the natural and eternal law and is directed towards the common good and the virtue of its citizens. As Thomas puts it, now all law aims to control those subordinate to it. So it is in the nature of law to foster virtue in its subjects, unquote. So for Thomas, the law is a pedagogue. It helps those of us who are not yet virtuous at least recognize what virtue is. But Thomas has a very realistic and textured understanding of the law. For instance, although the governing body is responsible to foster virtue among its citizens, it is not practicable nor possible for the law to enforce all virtue. He says, quote, laws must fit the human condition and be possible according to the nature and customs of the land. Since the majority of men to whom the laws apply are not very virtuous, human law forbids only the more serious wrongdoing, chiefly what would harm others and must be kept in check if human society is to be preserved, unquote. So obviously Thomas doesn't mean that society's laws have to embody all of the eternal law or all of the natural law. What they need to do is forbid the worst and most grievous offenses against the natural law and leave private virtue kind of to families and things like that. Finally, in spite of the fact that the natural law can't contain the whole thing, it also can't contradict, society's laws can't contradict the natural law. So even though they don't enforce all of the natural law, they cannot contradict the natural law. Before we leave Thomas behind, a few words about the relationship between temporal and spiritual power are in order, and I'll just say this very quickly. For Thomas Aquinas, the Pope, because he was the head of the spiritual order, was superior to the king or the emperor. That was that simple. However, with a big caveat that the Pope was not supposed to interfere with the kings or the princes in areas out of his jurisdiction. His area was theology and morals, and therefore he wanted to allow a proper autonomy for temporal leaders to do their work. The only time that the Pope could intervene is if those temporal leaders were doing something to violate something that directly bear on Catholic theology or Catholic morals. So Thomas definitely has a distinction of powers, with the Pope being superior when push comes to shove, if you want to put it that way. That's Thomas's way of acknowledging that God is higher than the emperor. And the Pope stands for that in the West. In the East, without a Pope, things got dicey. I won't go into that. Here I end my overview of the political tradition which stems from the early Greeks. And I want to now skip ahead and talk about a little bit about Hobbes and Locke. And one of the things I want to do in this presentation here, or in this talk, is to get you to see how radical the break with this tradition occurs in Hobbes and Locke. And I want to drive that point home because the American political experiment is impossible to even think about. It's unthinkable without John Locke. Regardless of how much influence he had, it is unthinkable, the American Revolution, without the thought of Locke. And so we have to acknowledge this as Catholics in America, that our political system is based on a break with that tradition. Now, what that means and how we negotiate that, that's above my pay grade. But I want to at least impress that point upon you to give you pause about how thoroughly American you feel like you need to be. That's part of my point tonight. Chap, I think, touched on some of these things in his talk too. I'm sure he did. He's much more curmudgeonly than I am. Okay. Let me try to pick up somewhere here. Okay, so historically speaking, Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and Locke, 1632 to 1704, live at a time when England is trying to establish its independence from any Catholic interference. Hobbes and Locke were both deeply anti-Catholic and deeply in favor of England's emancipation from Catholic control, as they saw it. The political philosophy outlined by Thomas and Augustine, wherein a Catholic temporal leader works in concert with Catholic spiritual leaders to establish a society informed by the rule of Christ, is Hobbes and Locke's worst nightmare. Indeed, Locke was very likely directly involved in the assassination of Catholic King Charles II. In short, even historically speaking, we must concur that the founders of liberal thought are deeply antithetical to the Catholic tradition of political thought. We can also go far as to say that they begin their thought with a deep desire to neutralize the Catholic Church's influence on the political order and on the temporal sphere. You might say that the conclusion of their political works is already there in the beginning before they even put pen to paper. They already know what they're after. And my thing is, I would suggest they devise a political philosophy to fit what they're after. What they're after comes first. The political philosophy legitimizes it. And we could finally say that all of their political and philosophical work together to achieve this main goal. Hobbes made it very clear that his political vision was intent upon sweeping the spirit of Rome out of the House of England. That's a quote. The philosophical foundation of Hobbes and Locke's political writings are thoroughly modern and follow hot on the heels of Descartes, even though the latter is considered a rationalist and they're considered empiricists. What they all agree on is that human beings are fundamentally alienated from the natural order that we described above in terms of Aristotle. They were alienated from the natural order that surrounds them, so that in order to find truth, they must either withdraw into themselves, that would be Descartes, or must rest content on only knowing the appearances of things, that would be Locke and Hobbes. Or to use Locke's language, we only know primary qualities, shape, extension, number. We don't know secondary qualities, color, taste, etc. We only know the outsides of things. Locke, for instance, calls even the most obvious things into question. This is what modern philosophers do. For instance, whether I am the same man whether I am the same man now as I was when I started reading this paper. Locke would call that into question. Or whether a fetus born of a woman is actually a human being. Locke literally raised the question, how do we know that a fetus, even out of the womb, is a human being? Because all we see is the shape. We don't see humanness, right? Or whether thinking is distinctively human power. Locke even suggested in good nominalist fashion that God could make matter think if he wanted to, totally denying, therefore, the inherent natures of things or the intelligence of God in the natural order. God is a totally whimsical God in Locke's view who can make anything happen. He can make 2 + 2 = 5 if he wants. Both Hobbes and Locke work hard and work against both common sense and the philosophical tradition to radically undermine what human beings can know, but perhaps even more importantly, work to make sure that they are no longer able to grasp what is natural in things. The whole idea of nature gets radically modified. This will have 2 important effects in their project. First, it will allow them to avoid any norms or limits placed on them by nature outside of mere self-preservation. And second, it will allow human beings an absolute mastery over nature insofar as the limits contained in nature can no longer allegedly be known. So they get 2 sets of freedom here from nature by denying they can know nature. They can have absolute mastery over it because it has no ends of itself, and they can have absolute freedom with regard to their own bodies because the human being has no natural ends to limit it. Here is Christopher Ferreira on both Locke and Hobbes. This is a little bit of a complicated quote, but I think you'll get it. He calls it Hobbelockianism, and I love that. He says, Hobbelockian sense perceptionalism, which openly denies or negates via radical doubt any quality of man beyond sensory, perceivable matter of which his body is composed, was a crucial contribution to the Western world's descent into skepticism about man's very nature and destiny. That development represented a radical break with Greco-Catholic tradition and thus an essential intellectual preparation for the revolutions that created secular nation states. Now that this philosophical damage has been done, we can look at the state of nature. Since Hobbes and Locke are looking for a new foundation upon which to build a new sort of political order, it is important that they don't begin either with man as conceived by Aristotle, that is, as a rational animal, or with man as conceived by Judeo-Christian tradition as created in God's image and as naturally desiring communion with God and fellow human beings. Instead, they invent a totally imaginary state of nature. Their differences notwithstanding, both men describe human beings in their pre-political state. In that state, human beings are fundamentally self-interested and are locked in a world with other human beings who are likewise fundamentally self-interested. In their states of nature, there are no families, only individuals. Although Locke tries to paint a rosier picture than does Hobbes, both men agree that in the state of nature, we have a war of all against all, or at least we have a situation that quickly degenerates into a war of all against all. Again, it is interesting to point out that in the state of nature, there is no politics, but we should also point out there is no religion. There's no God in the state of nature, magically. Nor is there a pre or post-fallen condition. This Christian story of human beings where we're created just, and then we fall into sin is totally absent their thinking. As Leo Strauss puts it, Hobbes and Locke denied the importance of the fall and accordingly asserted that what is needed for remedying the deficiencies or the inconveniences of the state of nature is not divine grace, but the right kind of human government. Politics to the rescue. You should be picking up here that what's going to happen is by diminishing the importance of religion, they're going to heighten the importance of politics. We already know statistically, right? As people quit practicing seriously a particular faith, they become more political, more politicized. That's an interesting thing that we're finding out in current politics. That all comes from Hobbes and Locke. By beginning with human beings are fundamentally individuals who are fundamentally interested in only preserving their life and what is theirs, Hobbes and Locke have to prioritize rights over duties. This is the second big move of modern politics. Indeed, in the state of nature, human beings have no duties at all. Both men, for instance, cast radical doubt on the ability of human beings to know anything about what is right and what is wrong, and both reduce the law of nature to the law of self-preservation. All we care about is preserving ourselves, our bodily well-being, furthermore. Locke goes on to say that vice and virtue are just names that we learn from society. They're not rooted in the nature of things. In other words, natural law is whatever a particular time and a particular society say it is. It would be impossible for Martin Luther King Jr. to criticize Jim Crow laws based on Locke, because Jim Crow laws would be natural because we say they are. Isn't that interesting? Before saying a word about the social contract, let's retrace the foregoing. Let's not. Let me say just a couple things about the social contract. Because we're not naturally political for Hobbes and Locke, Hock and Lobs, what has to happen is we have to get so frustrated in the state of nature because it's so violent that we voluntarily construct a contract that keeps us from taking each other's stuff. Government arises, therefore, out of a necessary evil that I don't want you taking my stuff and you don't want me taking your stuff. There's no natural inclination to politics. Therefore, government only has legitimacy when it is from the consent of a bunch of individuals. It's called government by consent. The Christian tradition totally rejects that. The Christian tradition says government is there because God puts it there. Even leaders like Nero are given to us by God, and we obey them as far as they don't contradict God. Hobbes and Locke call that into question, which provides the basis of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is based on the fact that we were being taxed without representation. If you had told Jesus, Augustine, or Aquinas that we were going to have a revolution because we were taxed without representation, they would not have been impressed with that. They would not have accepted that reason. Okay. I could say more things about Hobbes and Locke, but since we're getting to the end, let me take a few takeaways. The first thing I want to say is that part of what I'm trying to do here is to get you to realize that the break with the tradition that happens in Hobbes and Locke is a profound break, and that break has a radical influence on the founding fathers of our country. Now, there's a big debate as to how far-reaching that influence is, and I'll leave that to American historians. But the influence cannot be denied. And I think what we're experiencing in our society today is a couple of things. And so let me just close with a few casual comments. First of all, many of the Lockean ideas that I've gone over, the idea of the human being as an individual first and foremost, and only later as in a contractual relationship with other people, I think has haunted American politics from the beginning. And we can see it working in both parties, right? Keep your laws off my body, that's a left thing. You'll get my gun when you pry from my dead cold fingers, that's a right thing, but they're both Lockean fundamentally, right? So what I would like to suggest kind of in closing, if I can just now talk off the top of my head, is that this thinking that comes from Locke and Hobbes primarily and gets into Jefferson. Jefferson read Locke voraciously, has left an effect on both of our political parties in different ways. And because these ideas are dysfunctional, neither of our political parties can follow them consistently. Democrats can't follow them consistently when it comes to things like the environment. The environment is a common good that Democrats are interested in. And in order to preserve the environment, they have to radically limit individual freedom in the light of a common good that is an objective good. All of a sudden, they quit talking like Lockeans and they start talking like Catholics. Republicans know that the family is a common good that deserves to be respected and to be protected among various kinds of assaults. And so when Republicans start talking about family values, all of a sudden, the individual and their freedom and their rights kind of goes out the window, and they want law to actually support the natural family. in various ways, by protecting unborn children, by protecting marriage between man and a woman, for instance. All of a sudden, Republicans quit talking like Lockeans and start talking like Catholics. You see how that happens? But the problem is that neither of our political parties do this consistently. This is why it's very hard for us Catholics to vote. I have very good Catholic friends, very smart Catholic friends that are going to vote Democrat this time. And when I talk to them about it, they make very good arguments. I have very good, very devout, very smart Catholic friends who are going to vote Republican this time. And when they tell me the reasons they're going to do it, I agree with them. And yet, here we are. What I would like to suggest as a kind of closing thought, is the best service that we Catholics can do for American politics is to take that Catholic way of thinking that we occasionally bring in inconsistently and bring it in across the board. That might make it difficult for us to sidle up to either one of these inane parties that we have, but it actually might make a difference. I've been following this thing for 40 years, and we are not making a difference right now. The Catholic vote cancels out the Catholic vote in just about every single election. 49% of us vote Democrat, 51% vote. And then you know what else? When we get into our parties, we drop the part of the Catholic faith that disagrees with the party. And so we're not even being leaven and salt in the parties that we're sidling up to. And that would be my takeaway from this, which I get at by trying to point out the flaws at the basis of the system that we Catholics, because of this tradition, can see, but nobody else can see consistently. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howsare. Yes, another round of virtual applause. Thank you, thank you.
You're welcome, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, yes. And I'm gonna put the novena in the chat now. And for anyone that wants to stick around, I'll start the first night of that. But I did want to say thanks again to Dr. Howsare for wrapping it up, and for all of you that have been with us through this semester in this 3-part series. It has definitely, I've always left with more questions than answers, but I think that's the point. And tonight was no different, for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and lead the first night of the prayer for those of you that stick around. Thanks again. So let me just switch my screen here. In the name of the Father, and the Son, Holy Spirit, amen.
Amen.
Immaculate Heart of Mary, help us to conquer the menace of evil, which so easily takes root in the hearts of the people of today, and whose immeasurable effects already weigh down upon our modern world and seem to block the paths towards the future. From famine and war, deliver us. From nuclear war, from incalculable self-destruction, from every kind of war, deliver us. From sins against human life, from its very beginning, deliver us. From hatred and from the demeaning of the dignity of the children of God, deliver us. From every kind of injustice in the life of society, both national and international, deliver us. From readiness to trample on the commandments of God, deliver us. From attempts to stifle in human hearts the very truth of God, deliver us. From the loss of awareness of good and evil, deliver us. From sins against the Holy Spirit, deliver us. Accept, O Mother of Christ, this cry laden with the sufferings of all individual human beings, laden with the sufferings of whole societies. Help us with the power of the Holy Spirit to conquer all sin, individual sin and the sin of the world, sin in all of its manifestations. Let there be revealed once more in the history of the world the infinite saving power of the redemption, the power of merciful love. May it put a stop to all evil. May it transform consciousness, and may your Immaculate Heart reveal for all the light of hope. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.